Hi, everyone. It's Monday, December 12th, 2016 at 1:02 Eastern Time, and this is Admissions Live. I'm your host, Nicole Lentini, and on today's live broadcast, we're talking about NACAC's State of College Admissions Report. Admissions Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using the hashtag HigherEdLive. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Today's episode is made possible by Chegg Enrollment Services. Chegg is the leading digital student marketing firm for higher education. Combining name lists with digital outreach, Chegg partners can now double the size of their digital impact without adding any cost to their traditional recruitment and marketing budget. They call it names plus digital equals reach plus conversation. Visit edu.chegg.com or check the link we're posting on Twitter to start your 2018 search strategy today. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, digital, content, design, and more. M. Stoner recently released new research in partnership with Higher Ed Live and Chegg. Myth-busting websites reveals where perspectives from teens using college websites and higher ed marketing professionals converge and differ, and how marketers can leverage this knowledge. This research puts to rest 7 common myths about what prospective students like and don't like about college websites. The results might surprise you. We'll tweet out a link to the white paper now. So I am very excited to introduce a colleague, David Hawkins, NACAC's Executive Director for Educational Content and Policy. So David, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your history in education.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicole. And before we start out, I want to, first of all, thank you for having me. And note to everyone who's watching that apparently my setup here doubles as a banshee. So if it does get really bad, I'm going to ask Nicole to give me the panic thumbs down sign or something, and we'll try to motivate what's going on. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've been at NACAC now for 17 years, so I'm working my way towards some advanced degree in NACAC because I've been here as long as I've been in formal education. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to work for you and to advocate and to be a part of the profession. It's been a great experience, and it's something that I never get tired of. So I do appreciate the opportunity to work for all of you. What I thought I'd start with today is just a little bit of an overview of some of the key points that I saw as being relevant in 2016 from our State of College Admission Report. And here's my extremely low budget animation. I'd love for everybody to go online to the NACAC website and take a look at the report. You can read the full PDF, but our research team has also done a great job of breaking it down on the website so that you can read it in more digestible chunks. And I will also note that the NACAC website has been recently overhauled for those of you who have not yet seen it. So you're in for a brand new experience when it comes to web browsing with NACAC. So what is the State of College Admission Report, just briefly? We've been putting this report out since 2002. So it's been around a while now. It's probably about a freshman or sophomore in high school at this point. It's an attempt to provide an overview. And so in that way, those of you who work and live and breathe admission may find a lot of it to be obvious, but I think one of the things that it's really done well is it's served as the voice of the profession. And associations, I think, typically try to be that for its members. And so as we go through some of the key findings, we'll talk a little bit about how this can help you articulate important points to students and families, to folks on campus who you might come in contact with, including presidents who sometimes will ask you to do things that seem out of left field, and you'll have a way of putting that in context. But also folks like members of the media, policymakers, people who are genuinely interested in what I'll call the business of college admission. So with that in mind, really the three big points that jumped out to me in the 2016 edition of the report. It was, first of all, the yield rate is something we've looked at over the years. And since 2002, when the average yield rate for four-year colleges was about 48.7%. That's not really about, that's precisely 48.7%. Over the last decade and a half, that's dropped down last year to 35.7%. That's an average yield rate for four-year colleges. What that says, that's a really inside baseball type statistic. But what that single indicator, kind of like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, tells you is that uncertainty has been the order of the day in the very basic operations of the admission office for the last decade and a half. And what jumped out at me in this year's report was that the yield rate actually ticked upward a little bit, about a half a point. So we don't know right now whether that's a statistically significant jump. So in 2013, the average yield rate at four-year colleges was 35.7. This year, it came back at 36.2. So a slight increase. What that does for me is it makes me ask the question. I think in research, we're loath to say that any single year is a trend because it could be a data anomaly, it could be a number of things. So what we want to do is see if that continues, if it continues to tick upward, then what I think we could see is somewhat of something equivalent to a new equilibrium. So for many years, colleges basically had to each year reinvent the process to make sure they were going to meet all of the statistics that they rely on, that they have to meet from year to year. So, baseline enrollments, you don't want to be over or under enrolled. A lot of colleges care about what your acceptance rate looks like. So there's a lot of things that hinge on this yield rate. And if it were to stabilize a little bit, it could signify something of a new normal in the very basic nuts and bolts of admission. After 15 years of essentially throwing all the old formulas out the window. So what we hope, well, we don't really hope anything. We hope that admission offices can operate in a way in which they don't face uncertainty from year to year. But we're going to watch this yield statistic, because we do think that's something that, if it does continue, could mean something. So in addition to covering that, we cover all sorts of other data like acceptance rates and application numbers and things like that. So I would certainly encourage you to go in and look at what those say. Again, thinking about what you're talking to students and families about, for instance, can be informed by this report. The acceptance rate, for instance. A lot of people assume that applying to college is essentially cutthroat, competitive, the Ivy League, highly selective sort of mentality of single-digit acceptance rates. But what this report shows is that four-year colleges, in fact, on average, accept about 2/3 of their applicants. And when you talk to students and families about that, you can almost see the tension in the room easing and dissipating a little bit. Because you always are going to have your students who are shooting for the highly selective colleges. But what I think that happens is that a lot of students confuse that process with the process overall. And the fact of the matter is, most students will not be going through a process like that to go to college. And so I think we want to be able to articulate those points.
That's I just want to highlight that. I want to just put that on the side of buildings, is that not every school is an Ivy League school and top tier. So I'm glad that you said that.
Right. Well, and nor should every school be that selective. I think when your chances of getting into a college approach, the chances of winning the lottery, then, you have to ask, what is this all about, really? And that's certainly not to disparage our highly selective institutions. But for most students, the best fit for them is going to be a college that, in many ways, is very accessible. So that's an important point to make. I think the second broad point that I would make, particularly to this group, is the importance of the counselor data that we put in there. And when I say counselor, I mean our secondary school friends. Every year we publish the student-to-counselor ratio, which is 476 to 1. That includes all schools, including elementary schools. So when you sort of boil it away and to take out the elementary schools, and then you look at only counselors who have some responsibility for college advising, you get a ratio that's about 350 to 1. So we know that, that's something that, that's a caseload that's kind of unmanageable. We want to be able to give students individualized attention. And we know actually from a report that we've released since the State of College Admission Report, that school counselors make a statistically significant positive impact on students' college aspirations and their college outcomes. So that their outcomes in the sense of applying to and enrolling in college. And that's a report that we've recently put on the NACAC website as well, so I'd encourage you to go and look at that. But the reason I mention that is that oftentimes the role of the school counselor is not something that is well publicized in the college admission process. And given the fact that we know now, from a statistical standpoint, we've always known this in our guts, but from a statistical standpoint, we know that school counselors make a difference. And so I think that one of the key activities that admission officers can engage in the coming years, particularly and we'll talk about this a little later, as we get into the political climate and what might happen to education funding and things like that, it's going to be really critical particularly for admission officers to advocate for our friends and colleagues on the school counseling side. I'm sure you probably know, but families, policymakers, administrators, they all listen to admission officers. Admission officers are almost have a mythical quality to them that when they speak, people tend to listen. So I do think it's an important advocacy point and an important part of the report that I wanted to draw out, particularly in 2016. And from a very practical perspective, I think you'll probably find yourselves working with already do find yourself working with a lot of overtaxed school counselors. So it always helps to be mindful of their situation as well.
Absolutely. They're one of the most important advocates in our side of things, and that partnership is vital. So happy to continue to advocate. I want to ask really quickly, David, sorry to catch you midpoint.
No.
But has that number drastically changed over time? Is that pretty consistent with what you've seen the last few years? I mean, has there, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Can you kind of give a little bit of background around that?
It is, yeah, sure. It has slowly started to trend downward, so getting a little better. But the pace of the change has been so slow that I think years ago when we started the report, we might have been up around 480, 490, somewhere in that range. So and of course, when you're talking about numbers of this magnitude, you are making some gains. So I do think it's important to recognize those gains, particularly when, again, we could be heading into a policy a policy environment where education funding is not necessarily going to be a priority. It's important to be able to point to the fact that in order to keep the pipeline flowing for higher education, you're going to need people there to help the students. And given that we know school counselors make a difference, it's not only in the interest of the public good that admission offices and those of us involved in advocacy would support school counselors, it's also in institutions' interests to support school counselors. Because not only will they keep the pipeline going, they'll also turn out the next generation of students from an increasingly diverse population. And that's going to be a critical point that we want to articulate. So how I know we're having a few sound problems, and again, I'll apologize.
It's okay. It stayed about the same. I was hoping maybe that little note I sent you would help. I don't know. Thank you all. Thank you, listeners and viewers, for your patience with that. It's not too bad. We can still get your main points, David. But sorry to listeners.
No, well, and the last point I would make, just here at the outset, is just for everybody to take a look at the factors in the admission decision section of the report. That tells you what you already know, which is the order of the various factors in the admission decision. The one thing I wanted to note, the two quick things. One is that we also collected that information about international students and about transfer students. And the first year freshmen that don't come from an international background, it's been grades basically in college prep courses, admission test scores, essay, writing sample, on down the list, counselor recommendations, etc. The way it changes for international students is that the English language proficiency score tends to be the #1 factor. And then in transfer students, it's obviously the academic record from the sending institution or institutions. The rest of it sort of falls into place as you would expect. And the reason I mention that chart is, first of all, because when we talk to the media, when we talk to families and students, when we talk to policymakers, you'd be amazed at how few people are familiar with that list. In fact, I was telling Nicole prior to joining the chat here that my son is a junior in high school right now, so he is very much in the college pipeline. But I was at when he was back in 8th grade, our school counselors put on a session for scheduling high school courses, and it quickly I had the NACAC voice in my head, members telling me year after year, you got to have students enjoy high school. It's not just a springboard to college. You have to take it for what it is. It's a wonderful learning opportunity. So here I am in that mindset. And a relatively aggressive parent stands up and says, you know what, I don't know why we're so concerned with students' coursework, because we all know that all the colleges care about is their SAT scores. And of course, the school counselors knew better, and they knew that I work at NACAC, so they looked over at me and they could see the fumes coming out of my head. But fortunately, they had a terrific answer, and I think it was a good thing that they had it there. So again, you never want to assume that people know all this stuff, and I think that one of the real values in this report is that you're able to take this with you, and you're able to say, look, don't just take my word for it. Look at this report that this authoritative source has developed, which the authoritative source is actually you. It's just that we're collecting all your voices and articulating it. So that's just. I'll close with that point as an overview, and I know, Nicole, you had some thoughts that you wanted to cover, and whatever questions you'd like to cover. We can go more deeply into any of this, of course, but I just wanted to give a quick overview.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for covering that. I always find, the insight from the State of College Admissions report really enlightening and helps me to figure out, like, okay, are we about on the same path as everybody else? Is this a weird trend that only we're seeing? So, some of those are actually really encouraging and great to hear as far as my own institution, and I'm sure other counselors feel the same way. I'm keeping an eye on Twitter, too, so I don't see any questions yet. It's mostly Gil and Chris, so hello to both of them and everybody else that's watching. So yeah, and then they are sharing great insight out, so I hope people are keeping an eye on those tweets as well. If you do have any questions, feel free to tweet us with the hashtag HigherEdLive, and I will make sure to ask David on air. But yeah, I had sent you some kind of thoughts about what's happened this past year ahead of time about, there has been a lot of changes in admissions this year, and I know I'm preaching to the choir with all my counselor friends and school counselor friends that are watching right now, but I was curious about kind of what you've seen at the higher level at NACAC and kind of any insight you could share. And so the first one I wanted to just talk about a little bit was prior year, and kind of, have you heard any, even if it's just early stages of hearing things, have you seen any trends that you found interesting, like earlier applications or anything like that that you think would be helpful to know about what's happening nationwide?
Yeah, well, just when the nuts and bolts of the admission process look like they may be heading for some new equilibrium, like I said earlier, may or may not be, the rest of the world decides they're going to throw curveballs at us. So you have my sympathy. I mean, I think I've shared in the amount of change we've had to digest in this year. But for prior year, I think we all started the year with a great deal of uncertainty. School counselors, and we've done a little bit of research that we haven't released just yet, but we got a grant from the Gates Foundation by way of the National College Access Network to look at PPY and its effects on counseling and admission. And as part of that, we did a little research, and school counselors, we found, tended to be pretty early on making adjustments, because they had to start talking to their juniors back earlier this year in preparation for the October 1st release date. Colleges were a little more, they had conversations much earlier in the process because they knew this was coming. but the changes didn't start to really take place until they started into their fall sort of planning and recruitment. So what we've seen so far, again, school counselors moving things back, basically. And we've been very careful to advocate that to anyone who will listen, that school counselors now have to do both college advising, application advising, and financial aid at the same time of year. So that while we really like the idea of getting students into the FAFSA process earlier, we want to stay mindful that the help there is limited, and we need to be mindful of that. On the college side, we heard a lot of concerns early on that it was going to really turn the admission world upside down. And what we've seen so far is that it hasn't done that in year one. That's a good thing. And what I mean by hasn't turned the admission world upside down, there's been a lot of heavy lifting. Don't get me wrong. There's been a lot of adjustments made, and it's important that they be made. What I haven't yet seen is any sense of one way or another whether applications for admission have shifted dramatically. What we know from research is that there has been a slight increase in the number of financial aid forms submitted, the number of students submitting the FAFSA, when you compare it to the first month or two in previous years when it used to open in January. And I have seen some consultants' reports to suggest that there is at some colleges, a fair number of colleges, a larger number of applications for admission coming in earlier. But we really probably will need to wait and see and get a broader perspective to see if that's just at a certain type of college, if that's true for most colleges or anything like that. So, and I'd say the one thing that colleges and universities have done, at least from what I've seen in the research, a really good job of is trying to preserve as much of the process, sort of the spacing of the process for the students. Because as you know, they have the statement of principles of good practice to think about, but inside the brackets of the earliest notification date and the May 1st response date, there's still a lot of room in there to maneuver. So most colleges, I think, have taken a sort of a year one pilot approach, and maybe in the spring, when we release our initial research on year one, we'll maybe start to see how this all played out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that at least early insight. And I realize I'm asking this way too early in the process for any real significant things to happen. But, I'm really intrigued to see, is it going to impact application numbers and yield, in the years ahead? It'll be interesting to see if we see any sort of spike or dent along the way. So, so thank you. I have another question of something that's probably too early to really be able to have a ton of insight on, but other big change. The poor junior into senior class this year, I felt for them because they had prior year, and the students and the counselors especially, but prior year, and then the new SAT. And so I know it's early for us yet. It's, the first year everybody's using the new SAT scores, but have you heard anything from any colleges about if that's, had any impact, if they've seen distinct differences? Have you seen any colleges that are doing anything differently with how they're using that? I'm just curious of what's happening out there.
Well, a couple of things to note. One, you're absolutely right. It's, anytime you talk about admission tests and how they've either changed or how they might be affecting a cohort of students, you tend to have to wait and see. So I hate to report no news essentially on that front. But having said that, I haven't heard a lot from the student's perspective. I mean, I think as with PPY, a lot of students who are going through the process who may or may not have had older siblings, to them this is the process. So in a lot of ways, it's continued along as it has in the past. Obviously, colleges are going to need to look at their predictive validity research to figure out, is this going to be, are these scores more or less equally predictive of success in the first year versus the years past. And to that end, I think the biggest story that I saw in 2016 was sort of the really inside baseball discussion about the concordance tables. And I'm sure you tapped into that. And again, as with anything, the ACT jumped out there with what they felt was a concordance table that worked. College Board said, well, hang on for a minute, we need to do a little more research. And I think the idea is that ultimately those two entities are going to have to come to agreement on what constitutes concordance, and then that'll help colleges, of course. So in the interim, there's more uncertainty for you. Colleges need to make these decisions, and those of them that use SAT and ACT scores are gonna have to kind of fly blind for a little while. The other point that I wanted to mention in response to that is that we did issue a report earlier this year on predictive validity studies at colleges and universities, and we found that of the colleges that require an admission test for admission, which is about 75, about 3/4 of the four-year colleges in the country, only about half of those colleges do predictive validity research. And I know that it's at a lot of colleges there are resource constraints. Institutional research might be one person or half person, or I don't know. There's not a lot of capacity at a lot of colleges. So, and by half person, I mean a person whose time might be spread. I don't think there's a around doing it.
Or just one arm, one leg, half a head.
Yeah, or like a split long legs person. Yeah, that would be really freaky. But the idea that NACAC is trying to promote is that this is really important research to do, and so we hope in the years to come we can help institutions that are resource constrained be able to do that, because to the point of your question, colleges really don't know what a new or an old test gives them if they don't do the research. So I think that's a really key point, and wanted to make sure that I mentioned that report was out there on the NACAC website for anybody who wants to look at it.
That's really, really great to know, and it's definitely something I'm going to look for. And your timing of saying that was right on with Gil asked, can we ask if we have seen a move to colleges using predictive analytics more with admissions decisions? So very timely in that response. But
good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's an important one. And I mean, this may be more anecdotal than anything else, but I feel like in just conversations I had on the road this year, I feel like colleges are starting to think about how to do that better and do that more. We have a wonderful reporting specialist in our office, and she loves data and she loves these numbers and things. And so she's doing some really cool dashboards and some really cool work trying to dig deeper into how we can use these predictive analytics better. I know there's organizations out there that do it. So I do think we're making a really nice move in that direction, and I hope that more colleges do it, because I think, rather than just continuing to dump more students into the top of the funnel, I think the numbers that you shared earlier show that we need to think of better methods and to predict better and to recruit smarter and do all those things better. So,
yeah, well, and I'll also interject that in my mind, it becomes increasingly important to do that research because of the Fisher case that came down from the Supreme Court last year. And clearly, they were of the mind that there needs to be robust research around the admissions process, particularly as it pertains to the use of race and ethnicity in admission. And I think that predictive validity research, not just with regard to admission test scores, but really all around, can help paint a more nuanced and accurate picture of how admission works at an institution that is at all selective. I mean, if you're open enrollment, clearly your research takes on a different form. But I think that has a lot of added value now that the Supreme Court has ruled and has set some clear expectations for what would constitute a legal approach to the use of race and ethnicity in admission.
That's a really, really excellent point. Yeah, it's all the more reason why we need to really be intentional about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and have an understanding and being able to express that from, VP all the way through to admission counselor, and everybody in between needs to be able to understand that mission and understand why we select the students that we do. So right. I think, it's an excellent point. One more, all my things I want to ask you about are like fairly new, so I apologize. I get two more things and they're both like, I don't know, we'll see. But I feel like tons of offices, obviously, admissions in particular was pretty heavily affected by FLSA coming in, but then it kind of got halted, but some offices still move forward, so, and just thinking about what that's gonna look like next year? I mean, have you heard any interesting conversations? Do you feel like you're seeing any college, more colleges go in one direction or the other? Again, too early to tell. Did you see a lot of schools? Have you seen anything interesting happen in the months leading up to that, and in it actually kind of halting right before December, essentially? Kind of what you've seen, at least on the ground so far, with that.
Well, we just did a survey last month to kind of get a last-minute look at what colleges were doing with the new overtime rule. And we released it, I think, 2 days before the court put a hold on the regulation. So, first of all, addressing that hold, addressing that court decision, it really, I know the Obama administration has requested an expedited appeal from the court, and the court has granted it. They haven't actually ruled on the appeal, but that process will move its way along fairly quickly. Those of us that watch this stuff here in Washington, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure that whether the appeals court will say okay or not okay to the prior decision. But bottom line is we're about to go into a political environment where there's really no support for this regulation. So even if the court reverses the lower court, if the appeals court reverses the lower court, we still may be headed to a point where this is not actually going to happen. And I have heard people who are lawyers saying they don't think the court is going to reverse. So that's a bit of a political climate or legal climate. Now, in terms of what the colleges are going to do, the colleges that we polled seemed like they were fairly well on their way, although there were a surprising number that still didn't know what they were going to do. The timeline was so short that and that's part of what we communicated to the Department of Labor here, that this really was a short timeline. Probably the best I can say is that it's certainly that I've heard anecdotally that there are some colleges who are just basically saying, "Oh, forget it. We have our system. We're going to keep going." And should these regulations not go into effect, that's a perfectly legal and option for them. There's no legal impetus to make that change. I have also heard from colleges that said, we put a lot of work into this. We may have even announced something. And we figured that even if it doesn't go through in its current iteration, somewhere down the line, this thing might come back up again. Come back up again. I'm pretty sure it will. So they may not go as far as the overtime rule was going to require them to go in terms of the salary threshold, but they may, I think institutions may take a look at this and say this is an opportunity to sort of step-ladder ourselves into a process where we regularly look at this and stay ahead of the legal climate. Because I really do think that this caught pretty much all of us off guard. I'll say with the exception of the University of Michigan, who apparently had gone into compliance with this even a decade before it was hatched into being. Bottom line is it did catch a lot of people off guard, and I think they might use this as an opportunity to sort of to stay apace even if the regulatory requirement isn't there.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really thoughtful answer. I didn't realize you had done that survey, so I'm going to go check that out after the show. But you know what I think is kind of cool too, and I mean, maybe it's more, I know this was internally at our institution, and we can't be the only ones that this happened at, but it kind of made HR try to pay more attention to the amount of hours we work, which I think is not a bad thing, to be just conscious of. I mean, admissions is a very difficult job to try to explain to people who aren't in it, and the kind of hours that we work, can vary so drastically and so differently on the road and in the winter, and it's incredibly unpredictable. So I think it'll be really interesting to see offices that did move forward with it still, like ourselves, to see what kind of insights HR offices might be able to kind of loop back around to us after a year of this. So needs to be seen, I guess. But.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you brought up a very great point about the political climate, and that's kind of one of my last questions I want to ask about, where we're currently at. And again, this is something that is very hard to predict, and especially because, the president-elect hasn't really spoken a lot about his plans for education as much as some of the other candidates had. But, do you have any insights to share as to what you kind of expect, at least the initial impacts on higher education to be from the new president?
Yeah, I mean, when I was making notes for this conversation today, I wrote 3 huge question marks there. So, my answers are pretty consistent here. In that some of the folks who are viewing this might say, "What exactly is he doing down there? He doesn't know anything." But no, this is something that we're all watching with a great deal of trepidation, a great deal of concern, because you're right that candidate Trump did not say a lot about education during the campaign, and what he did either do or say tended towards pretty dependable, old and not particularly useful or effective reference points. And I'll clarify that by saying one of the examples he gave was eliminating the Department of Education. That's been a talking point for decades now. I mean, the department was only signed into law, or the department was only elevated to a cabinet-level agency under the Carter administration, so it really hasn't been around that long in geologic time. But the idea that you would want to eliminate the Department of Education is a very scary prospect. Pell Grants are administered by the Department of Education, student loans, counseling programs, Gear Up, TRIO, and the entire elementary and secondary federal funding structure. I mean, it just so I bring that up to say I really don't know what to expect from this administration. Now, what we're concerned about is maintaining and improving public funding for both K-12 and higher education. We want to maintain the progress we've had on our school counselors, with advocating for school counselors and getting both state and federal investment in their resources and their staff. Undocumented students is something that we're obviously that's probably if you had to triage things out, that's probably the first thing we're going to have to really see through. Because on the one hand, you're worried about the DACA kids, and you want to preserve their, what they've gained. What it allows us to do is go back and say, why haven't we passed the DREAM Act yet? Why have we not made these students fully legal? Why have we not solved this problem? Despite the fact, and this goes back to as early as 2000, you've had bipartisan support for the DREAM Act for a long time. In fact, it got to the point where it needed a 2/3 majority of the Senate to pass into law, and it fell short by 1 or 2 votes. That was about 4 or 5 years ago. Everything to me is about 4 or 5 years ago now, so it could have been 10, I don't know. But so we're worried about them. We're worried about, obviously, diversity, access, and inclusion. We're worried about funding for need-based financial aid for college. And finally, if you know me, if you've heard anything I've said over the years, is that we're concerned about predatory colleges, particularly from the for-profit sector. We made a lot of gains under the Obama administration in protecting students, and if you think about Trump University, if you think about the fact that the prospective Secretary of Education has a fondness for privatization of education in general, I think to say we're not optimistic is probably an understatement. But then again, I have to say, we have, as recently as today, seen reports that there is some interest in Congress in moving forward in a bipartisan way on things like undocumented students. Senators Graham from South Carolina and Durbin from Illinois have just introduced something called the Bridge Act, which would help the DACA students. So I tend to be an optimist, and I hope that in what feels like maybe a fairly scary moment that we may be able to have some movement on issues that have traditionally proved pretty thorny. So that's my crystal ball in a nutshell. Here's the takeaway. We're going to keep doing what we've done at NACAC. We are going to advocate for our interests, and so I hope that those of you listening in will stay tuned, because we are going to be out there, and we're going to want folks to listen to what we have to say. So you can count on us to keep up the the advocacy and keep up the pressure on folks that want to go the wrong direction.
And we are so grateful for that. We're so grateful for you and the advocacy you do on, for colleagues on both sides of the desk. And, everything you've brought up today is just so vitally important to continue to see the success for our students. So, I appreciate your optimism, and I'm right there with you. I'm hopeful that we can see some good things happening in the year ahead, even when we're feeling, the pressure from some other kind of negative experiences that have happened. So I appreciate you looking into your crystal ball and seeing some good things too. So I appreciate you looking forward so much, and I guess round that out in general by saying, what are you kind of looking at for the year ahead? What are the, you've mentioned some of the big kind of key focuses, focusing on DACA students, focusing on, advocacy for counselors. Anything else that, we should be aware of is kind of up and coming in the year ahead and things you're going to be focusing on?
Yeah. Well, certainly I had listed, 4 main ideas. The first one we already touched on, the sort of the bumpy road ahead in terms of the political context. I think we really are going to have to watch that. Everybody knows that. The second, I also mentioned earlier, which was sort of the nuts and bolts of admission. What are we going to see with yield? What are we going to see with application volume? Things like that, and how will the economy, will the economy continue to improve? Will it sort of backslide? There's a lot of moving parts there that might affect the nuts and bolts of admission. But on a maybe a different note, something I haven't mentioned yet, two quick things. One, and it is related to the political climate, but we've heard a lot of speculation about how a Trump administration is going to affect or not affect international student enrollment in U.S. institutions, and I think that's a real question. I remember having worked at NACAC for 17 years, a lot of the same questions being asked after 9/11 back in 2001. And it, there was an effect, at least for a time. So the idea that what America does and says matters, and we as institutions first and foremost, and then secondly as people, or you can reorder those if you want. The direction we're moving on this planet is that we're becoming closer to each other. The cultural gaps are narrowing. And we're becoming a more diverse place in general. So what we want is to continue the movement towards education as sort of a global good. We want students to come to the United States. We want to not only for them to learn about what we have to offer, but for our students and our citizens to learn from what those students have to offer that are coming from other countries. So that's the first additional item. The second and final thing I'll mention is that you may have heard that NACAC is actually engaged in an overhaul of its statement of principles of good practice. So this is a bit of a plug for our NACAC process here. But this is the core document. This is why NACAC was formed. And I think in that increasingly global environment where the definition of a student enrolling in college is far different than it was in 1937 when the organization was formed, we want this document to stay relevant, and we want some of the tenets of the document, the good that it can bring to the traditional student population to be applicable to anybody, to transfer students, to international students, to adult learners. So we're in a process that's going to take most of 2017 to go through, and what I'll say as a takeaway is that we will be looking for extensive member input into that, and particularly, we want this to go far and wide. We want anybody who has an interest in this to take a look. So I would just say to stay tuned. We have a special steering committee that's working on this right now. And when it gets to a point where they feel like they're ready to roll something out for feedback, and I'd say probably closer to mid-2017, maybe spring to mid-17 will be the time frame. Stay on the lookout. We definitely want your feedback on that.
Excellent. Oh, I'm excited. I actually was unaware of that, so I'm really excited to see the changes and how it reflects today's kind of world in education, because it's a very different place. And I want to put a plug for it too. If you are in this field and are not familiar with the Students of Good Practice, you should probably acclimate yourself with those pretty well. They're pretty vital in knowing and kind of doing good work in this industry. So I'm excited to see that. We'll have to have you back on again next year. Oh my goodness. Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you, David. Were there any other thoughts that you wanted to leave us with before we sign off?
I think I'm good. I'll only say that, thank you, reiterate my thanks for having me on, and obviously you know where to find me. So if you or anyone has questions to follow up, I'm always eager and willing to help.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure having you on. Thank you, viewers, for checking it out and, tweeting along with us, sending great thoughts and questions. And thank you for those checking this out in the archives. And thanks, as always, to our program sponsors, Chegg and M. Stoner. This was my last broadcast of 2016, so I look forward to seeing you all in 2017. Have a great day, everybody.